Snow whipped across the silent, moonlit street as shadows twisted against the warm glow of Christmas lights. A low growl rumbled from the massive German shepherd crouched at the edge of the driveway, ears pinned, teeth bared, eyes scanning the darkness with fierce precision. Mrs. Claus stumbled, her arms flailing as shadowy figures surged forward, their intentions dark and violent. The dog's muscles tensed, fur bristling, every instinct screaming danger, yet he hesitated, calculating the impossible odds. And then, without warning, he lunged. But could he protect her against the merciless force closing in, or was this Christmas Eve about to end in tragedy? Before the chaos of that fateful Christmas Eve, life moved at a gentle, comforting rhythm for Mrs. Claus and her loyal German shepherd, Max. Every morning, the scent of fresh pine and cinnamon filled the air as she shuffled into the kitchen, her hands worn but steady, while Max padded silently behind her, his deep chestnut coat glinting in the winter sun, eyes alert yet soft with devotion. He was more than a dog. He was her shadow, her protector, her constant companion through decades of quiet life in the snow-dusted village where the world seemed safe and slow. Together, they walked the frost-lined streets, Max sniffing every corner, nose twitching at the faintest hint of trouble, yet nothing had ever come of it, until recently. Subtle shifts began to unsettle the peaceful cadence. The way Max's ears twitched at sounds that had always gone unnoticed, the sudden intensity in his gaze toward the empty horizon, the low, rumbling growl he stifled in the back of his throat when shadows stretched too long across the walls of their cozy home. Mrs. Claus dismissed it at first as age or the dog's natural vigilance, but the unease had a rhythm all its own, a quiet drumbeat that refused to be ignored. Nights grew restless. Max would pace the living room, paws whispering over wooden floors, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling toward the faintest creak outside. He would sit by the window for hours, silent, immovable, eyes locked on darkness beyond, as if sensing something no human could see, something that would shatter the delicate warmth of their world. Mrs. Claus tried to soothe him, offering gentle scratches behind his ears and murmured reassurances, but he would barely register them, his body taut with silent urgency. Their bond had always been deep, an unspoken understanding built over years of quiet companionship, and now that bond was being tested by a creeping, unnameable tension. The village streets, once filled with twinkling lights and laughter, began to feel too still, too expectant, as if the very air held its breath. Max's instincts, finely tuned to the subtlest shifts in the world, prickled with a warning that Mrs. Claus could not yet read, a prelude to a storm neither of them had anticipated. And somewhere in that frozen hush, the first glimmer of danger stirred, hidden, silent but alive, and Max, ever vigilant, sensed it long before any human eye could, standing at the threshold of loyalty and heroism, ready to face a darkness that would test their bond like never before. As the hours of Christmas Eve unfolded, an invisible tension settled over the village, threading its way into every corner of Mrs. Claus's home, and Max could feel it in every fiber of his being. The wind howled through the pines outside, rattling window panes and carrying faint, almost imperceptible sounds that prickled his senses. Soft footsteps in the snow, the faint scrape of boots against stone, a whisper of movement where there should have been none. He paced the living room, muscles coiled like springs, ears swiveling toward each unfamiliar echo, tail rigid with focus. Mrs. Claus, knitting by the fireplace, occasionally glanced up at his rigid stance, trying to interpret the quiet language of his unease, unaware of the magnitude of the threat lurking just beyond the threshold. Every shadow seemed alive, twisting unnaturally as Max growled low in his throat, a deep, guttural warning that vibrated through the floorboards. The mail slot rattled with a tentative knock, and Max bolted to the door, a snarl freezing in his throat, yet the sound was empty, echoing only in the crisp night air. A sense of being watched pressed down on them. The usual jingling of sleigh bells in the village square had vanished, replaced by a suffocating, almost tangible silence. And then, faintly at first, a disturbance in the snow outside, footprints, large and deliberate, tracking closer to the house, scraping the path Max had once trotted confidently in peace. His ears pinned back, hackles rising, body taut as steel, he circled Mrs. Claus protectively, nudging her gently toward the back room, instinctively positioning himself between her and the unknown threat. Lights flickered overhead, casting elongated shadows that danced on the walls, morphing into shapes of menace in Max's sharp, watchful eyes. He darted to the window again, body pressed flat, nose quivering at scents carried by the winter wind. Leather, cold metal, the faint tang of malice that set his teeth on edge. Time stretched taut as the night thickened, each creak of timber, each whisper of snow, echoing like a drumbeat of approaching peril. The first muffled voice came then, Low, taunting, the sneer of confidence that only emboldens predators. Max's hackles bristled, teeth gleaming in the dim lamplight, a warning growl reverberating like distant thunder. Emboldens predators. Max's hackles bristled, teeth gleaming in the dim lamplight, a warning growl reverberating like distant thunder. Mrs. Claus's heart raced, panic gnawing at her as she realized the danger had crossed from her imagination into something tangible, something alive. Another shadow flitted across the frosted glass of the front window, figures moving in coordinated menace, circling, probing, waiting for the right moment to strike. Max's growl rose to a fierce roar as he launched himself at the nearest pane, claws scraping, teeth snapping, a fury of instinct and devotion fused into pure protective energy. Yet the attackers did not retreat. They paused, studying him, calculating, their cruelty deliberate. From the corner of the room, Mrs. Claus watched in helpless horror as Max's body tensed, every muscle ready to spring, his eyes burning with the knowledge of the threat she could not yet grasp. Each moment stretched into eternity, each heartbeat a drum of fear, each breath a countdown toward confrontation. The strange sounds multiplied, boots crunching in the snow outside, whispered curses, a faint metallic clink that made Max's ears swivel like radar dishes, sensing patterns invisible to human eyes. He leaped to the door again, teeth bared, growling with a depth that shook the floor, yet the assailants advanced steadily, their shadows growing, merging with the night. And then, in an instant, a deafening crash, windows rattling, the front door trembling as the first strike landed, and Max barked, a sound of raw, fearless defiance that cut through the night, every hair on his body standing in feral solidarity. Mrs. Claus stumbled backward, fear clawing at her chest, eyes wide as the dark shapes forced their way closer. Max lunged into the unknown, disappearing into the blizzard of snow and shadows, growls echoing off the walls, his presence a singular promise. No harm would come to her if he could stop it. Time slowed, the room thick with dread, and the question burned like fire in the frozen night. Would Max be enough to protect her from the cruelty barreling toward their door, or was this Christmas Eve about to become a nightmare without end? The door splintered under the first brutal strike, shards of wood scattering across the frosted floor as Max surged forward, a living force of muscle and instinct, teeth bared, eyes blazing with the fierce intelligence of a protector who would not yield. The shadowy intruders pressed in, faces obscured, intentions violent, and yet in that instant time seemed to fracture, slowed by the electricity of danger and loyalty intertwined. Mrs. Claus froze, terror rooting her to the spot as Max collided with the nearest figure, a blur of fur and fury, teeth sinking into leather with the precision of a soldier, claws raking through the snow-dusted rug, every motion honed by instinct and devotion. The attackers recoiled, shocked by the intensity of his assault, but one managed to lunge past the first wave, a cruel hand reaching toward her, and Max twisted mid-air, jaws snapping, a growl reverberating through the house like the tolling of a bell, catching the hand and hurling the assailant backward. The room became a chaotic ballet of shadows and sound. Splintered wood, crashing ornaments, the crunch of snow beneath boots, the guttural roar of the dog as he deflected each strike, blocked every advance, his loyalty burning brighter than fear, sharper than steel. In the midst of the melee, Mrs. Claus stumbled toward the corner, heart hammering, when suddenly Max froze, ears pricked to a sound she could not hear, a subtle shift in the storm outside that revealed the most unimaginable truth. These were not ordinary thieves but masked elites, a gang of wealthy bullies emboldened by power, targeting her home with a cruelty she could scarcely fathom, their faces twisted in sneering satisfaction as they believed they could overwhelm both her and her dog. Max's growl deepened, almost human in its intensity, a primal warning that echoed through the walls and into the bone, and then, as the first of the intruders tried to grab her, the most astonishing act of bravery erupted. He launched with flawless precision, pinning the would-be attacker against the shattered doorframe, teeth locked, growl cutting through the storm like a blade, while his body acted as an impenetrable shield, a living barricade between innocence and malice. Time became a blur of motion, Max pivoting, striking, snarling, circling, eyes never leaving Mrs. Claus, calculating every threat, anticipating every move, his courage amplified by an unspoken bond, each second weighted with the possibility of disaster. And then, just as the most dangerous figure stepped forward, Max leaped again, colliding with him in a whirlwind of fur and teeth, sending the attacker sprawling into the snow outside, a flash of the night sky reflecting in Max's determined eyes as if to declare victory over fear itself. But the twist, the part that made Mrs. Claus's heart stop, was that the final figure was not human at all but a shadow of betrayal from within her own world, someone she had trusted, cloaked in darkness, who had orchestrated the attack to test her resolve, to exploit vulnerability, and yet Max, sensing the deception in an instant, met the threat with unwavering ferocity, a protector who would not fail, who would not falter, who would give everything to preserve life and loyalty. The room was a storm of shattered dreams, splintered wood, and snow drifting in from the broken door, but through it all Max stood unwavering, chest heaving, eyes ablaze, a silent sentinel against cruelty, a living testament to the power of devotion. And as Mrs. Claus knelt to press her trembling hands against his fur, she realized, with a clarity born of terror and relief, that he had not only saved her life but had confronted darkness itself and stood triumphant, leaving only one thought blazing in her mind as the night finally settled into quiet. Courage is measured not by the size of the enemy, but by the heart that refuses to back down. Settled into quiet. Courage is measured not by the size of the enemy, but by the heart that refuses to back down. The snow outside had settled into a quiet blanket of white, muffling the chaos that had erupted just hours before, leaving only the lingering echo of splintered wood, trampled pine needles, and the faint, persistent beat of adrenaline still humming through Mrs. Claus's chest. And as she slowly rose from where she had collapsed beside Max, hands trembling yet instinctively reaching to smooth the fur along his massive neck, the reality of survival settled in with a fragile, almost unbearable weight. Max sat rigid but alert, ears flicking at every whisper of wind, eyes scanning the perimeter as if expecting the darkness to surge back at any moment, yet there was also a subtle easing in his stance, a slight wag of his tail that spoke volumes, the first hint that the storm had passed and that the protector could finally breathe without the imminent threat of violence pressing down. Mrs. Claus moved methodically through the wreckage of their home, surveying the damage wrought by intruders whose intentions were as cruel as they were calculated. The shattered front door, splintered ornaments scattered like fallen stars across the floor, curtains torn and snow drifting in to coat the hearth in a cold, crystalline layer, yet every object that had been broken seemed insignificant against the weight of what had been preserved: life, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond that Max embodied. She knelt repeatedly, brushing debris from his coat, murmuring soft words of gratitude and awe, and as she did, she realized that each moment of terror had also deepened their connection in ways that went beyond ordinary affection, for Max had not merely acted on instinct but had chosen, with an intelligence and courage that transcended species, to place himself between her and the darkness, a living shield whose bravery was immeasurable. The village slowly came alive again in the distance, the faint glow of lights piercing the horizon, but Mrs. Claus felt an acute sense of isolation, knowing that few could truly understand the magnitude of what had occurred, the raw, elemental clash between human vulnerability and animal valor, and yet in the quiet of the snow-laden living room with Max pressed close, she found a profound, almost sacred serenity, a realization that survival was not solely about escaping harm but about recognizing the extraordinary depth of trust and love that had carried them through the night. Emergency responders arrived eventually, their presence marked by flashing lights and the distant hum of engines. But even as they assessed the damage and ensured safety, it was clear to anyone observing that the true hero had already claimed the victory. A dog whose loyalty had rewritten the boundaries of courage, whose actions had transformed fear into triumph, whose silent vigilance had safeguarded not just a life, but the essence of hope and resilience. Mrs. Claus guided Max to a corner of the living room, laying a warm blanket on the floor and offering water, her fingers lingering on his fur, eyes glistening with tears she no longer bothered to hide. And as he drank, she traced the lines of his face with a tenderness reserved for those who have stood against death and emerged unbroken, feeling the weight of gratitude anchor her heart with the unspoken acknowledgement that some bonds cannot be measured by words, only by the shared heartbeat of survival and unwavering devotion. Days passed, and the village began to repair, the physical destruction slowly replaced by snow-sculpted streets and the glow of lanterns rekindled. Yet every morning as Mrs. Claus stepped into the soft white hush with Max at her side, she noticed subtle changes in their rhythm. A more deliberate glance exchanged, a pause in the walk where they each instinctively checked the other's safety, a quiet understanding that the world was unpredictable and often cruel, but together they were capable of confronting any shadow that dared approach. Medical checks revealed minor injuries, scrapes, bruises, and the soreness of exertion. But the emotional scars, though present, were overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of relief and triumph, the kind that settles deep into the bones and whispers, always that courage has a face and it sometimes wears fur. Max became a local legend in whispers and cautious admiration, his story circulating through the village like a tale from another era, yet he remained unchanged in his devotion, refusing accolades, content to lie by Mrs. Claus's side, ears twitching at every subtle sound, always vigilant, always ready, as though the night's events had cemented in him a sacred duty that transcended ordinary life. In the quiet evenings that followed, Mrs. Claus often found herself reflecting on the magnitude of their ordeal, tracing the mental map of danger that Max had navigated instinctively, marveling at the precision of his instincts and the raw courage that had turned potential tragedy into survival. And in doing so, she felt a profound lesson etch itself into her heart. That true bravery is measured not by the absence of fear but by the willingness to face it for those we love, that loyalty is not a transaction but a sacred trust, and that love in its purest form is an act of courage repeated relentlessly until safety and peace are reclaimed. The bond they shared had shifted, evolving from companionship into something unshakable, a mutual understanding that in the coldest, darkest hours, there would be a protector, a presence that would never waver, a soul whose devotion was absolute. And every time Max leaned his massive head into her lap, eyes soft and attentive, Mrs. Claus felt a swell of gratitude and reverence for the living proof of that truth. The village healed around them, Christmas lights twinkling once more, snow glinting like shards of glass in the morning sun, yet the memory of the terror lingered, not as a shadow, but as a reminder of the stakes and the triumph of courage, and in the serene hush of the restored home, with Max lying faithfully at her feet, Mrs. Claus closed her eyes for a moment and pressed her hands to his fur, feeling the steady pulse of life and loyalty beneath her palms, and in that profound, wordless connection she understood the immutable truth, that love and courage are inseparable, that loyalty is the truest form of heroism, and that no darkness, however menacing, can overcome the bond between a human and a dog who refuses to yield, for in that bond, the spirit of protection, devotion, and hope endures forever, unbroken and eternal. Hope endures forever, unbroken and eternal.